Chapter 12. Broken People. I remember traveling so often to the far western edge of the Pine Barrens to visit one of Grandfather's old friends. This man, who Grandfather called Half-Tree, was of Native American ancestry, though I had no idea as to which tribe he belonged. He lived deep in the woods without plumbing or electricity and generally kept to himself. It seemed that he had once lived in the confines of society, but was met with prejudice and rejection through much of his early life. He decided long ago to get as far away from people as possible and live as much as he could from the earth. He seemed to be an old, broken, and bitter man who rarely smiled. Grandfather seemed to be the only one he truly trusted, and I could not tell if it was because of Grandfather's power or the fact that he was also Native American. Half-Tree never paid much attention to Rick and me. In fact, I believe that he only tolerated us because of Grandfather. Though I had done nothing in the past to upset or bother him in any way, he seemed to hold me in the most contempt. Any conversation with him was always dealt in a very sarcastic way. When Grandfather was not around, he did not talk to me at all. I could sense a deeply hidden hatred in him, but I could not figure out why. After all, how much more could he want? He was living close to the wilderness and away from society. He seemed to have everything he needed, and he seemed to love the woods. I could not understand why he was always so unhappy. I didn't think that I ever heard him laugh, and rarely would he smile, even for Grandfather. Grandfather seemed, however, to understand what was bothering Half-Tree. I noticed that the two old men would talk for hours, and when they were done, Half-Tree seemed much more at peace. It was during these times that he would sometimes smile, and that made me think that somehow Grandfather was helping him through what had tormented him. As the months slipped by, I could see a definite change in Half-Tree. He smiled more often and would even talk to me. After a while, he would come to me and ask me a question about a skill that he had learned from Grandfather. He seemed truly appreciative of all we taught him. In fact, he learned the old skills with a greater passion than I had ever seen before. Even in the woods, he now seemed more at peace, and I often would hear him and Grandfather laughing over something. The change became remarkable, to a point where I could not believe that the old Half-Tree and this Half-Tree were in fact the same person. As the months passed and the improvement in Half-Tree became more dramatic, my curiosity began to get the better of me. I wanted to know what the original problem was that had tormented Half-Tree. He seemed to carry a deep hatred and even appeared to be wrapped in self-loathing at times. So too did Half-Tree seem to be haunted by some unseen secret that he suffered through by himself. I knew very well that Grandfather possessed the ability to heal, but what he had done for Half-Tree was a miracle as far as I was concerned. Since I was so interested in the medicine ways of healing, and had helped Grandfather so often collect the healing herbs, I decided to ask Grandfather how he was able to help Half-Tree. Grandfather said, "I was able to help Half-Tree because I once felt as he did. I was as broken and bitter inside as he, but I learned to heal myself and thus was able to heal him." Grandfather told me that Half-Tree was suffering from the same pain as were so many Native people. They had been imprisoned, their culture destroyed, their lands stolen, and they were not allowed to practice their skills of religion. Their families were torn apart, and they were forced to live the ways of the white man away from the earth. They were taught that their ways were primitive and wrong, that their religion and way of life was wrong, and they would have to learn to live like the whites. They were hated and scorned, looked upon as no better than white man's animals, and thus their spirits were broken. It was then that Grandfather told me the story of Payne. As Grandfather first began his long journey in life, he would slip on and off of the reservations unobserved. He was hoping that he would be able to find people to teach, people who wanted to learn the old ways. Though he found many willing students at first, he found that they would not stay with him for very long. They feared reprimand from the white man for learning and keeping alive the old ways. He found that more often than not, he was dealing with a broken and imprisoned people who seemed to have lost all hope and even belief. There he found poverty and starvation. The officials seemed to be corrupt, and the people lived in an appalling condition. Punishment was frequent and savage, and the people seemed to live in perpetual fear. Many could not even practice their religion freely. Children were quickly taken from their families when they reached school age. They were sent away to distant schools for re-education and sometimes never saw their families again. The land that they lived on was not productive, and they had to rely solely on the white man for supplies. The psychological warfare and brainwashing that these people were subject to was even more appalling than the conditions that they lived under. There was no peace to be found. The conditions were crowded, and many times the white man would pit one tribe against the other, even in the confines of a single reservation. Disease and starvation were killing more of these people than any war ever had, and alcohol was becoming an escape for many. It was on one of these journeys into the distant northern reservation when Grandfather was almost caught by a white patrol. He hid at the edge of the swamp, partially buried in the mud for several hours as the patrol watered their horses and ate. As the patrol finally began to saddle up and leave the area, Grandfather heard a stirring from the edge of the swamp, not far from where he lay. He knew that it must be the movement of a man, for it was too loud and erratic to be that of an animal. The men and horses took notice of the sound, too, and began to head in the direction of the sound. As they got closer to the origin of the sound, Grandfather heard a splashing moving quickly toward him. Whoever originally made the noise was now escaping in his direction, and rather loudly, too. The low brush parted as a young Native American man crawled through on his belly. The patrol was searching the area of the original noise frantically, and as the young man crashed through the brush in front of Grandfather, the patrol began to head his way. Without thinking, Grandfather reached up and grabbed the young man by the arm, covered his mouth with his hand, and pulled him into the mud. The young man struggled at first, but upon seeing Grandfather's face, he gave in to the mud. The men were closing in on the area fast, but would not venture out from the hard bank. Grandfather picked up a small stick from the brush clump and deftly tossed it into a clump of grasses not far from where he lay. A duck took flight in a sputter of whipping brush and flying water. The men of the patrol laughed and abandoned their search, figuring that it had been the duck that made the noise. Within moments they were riding out of sight. Grandfather pulled the young man from the mud, and they washed off in the water without a word. The young man looked at Grandfather in amazement, scrutinizing his buckskin clothes. The young man was definitely Native American, but he wore the clothes and shoes of the white man. He seemed to Grandfather to be a little ashamed of the way he was dressed. Grandfather, seeing the way the young man was eyeing him, said, "You look like you've seen a ghost." The young man retorted with a sound of amazement in his voice, answering, "Maybe a ghost from the past, old one. I didn't think that anyone like you still lived. I cannot believe how easily you helped me escape the patrol." Grandfather and the young man laughed long and hard at the surprise on the men's faces when the duck flew off, and that laughter seemed to put the young man at ease. Grandfather and the young man sat on the bank and talked through much of the day. He found that the young man did not have a Native American name but was called John, and he lived on a reservation not far from where they sat. He told Grandfather that the reason he was hiding from the patrol was that he was trespassing on private lands, and this area was off limits to everyone on the reservation, including the elders. He explained that the reason he was here was not to steal cattle as the white man suspected, but to locate a sacred place that the elders so often spoke of. He said that it was hard to find these places anymore, as most of the elders who knew of the old ways were dead or were very old. Many of the elders feared reprimand from the whites and would not openly discuss the old ways. John told Grandfather that he was trying to preserve what he could of the old ways that would soon be lost forever. Most of all, the wisdom of the religion of his people. He told Grandfather that many of the young men and women had gone off to try to live in the cities. Some had volunteered as soldiers in this Second World War that was going on. He also said that many had turned to alcohol and lived at the edge of starvation in slum-like conditions. Many of his people had lost their will to live, and the spirit of the tribe had been long since broken. He told Grandfather that he had tried to go outside the reservation to make a living, but there he was not fully accepted in the white society. He was ridiculed and hated. Prejudice and mistrust ran wild. He had felt less than a human. Only his search to save the old ways provided a sense of self-respect. John begged Grandfather to tell him his story. Grandfather briefly told of his quest and his life and how he, too, had sought to preserve the old ways. He told John how difficult it had been to find anyone who would listen to him and how he felt like many of these old ways would die with him. As Grandfather finished his story, a huge smile of satisfaction came over John's face, and he began to beg Grandfather to teach him. He said, "I have prayed for someone like you to come and teach me for so very long. I was beginning to lose faith that the Creator wanted to preserve these old ways." Grandfather smiled at John, seeing his enthusiasm, and told him that he did not have to beg. Grandfather would be willing to teach anyone who would listen. As darkness overtook the land, John wandered back to the reservation, and Grandfather stayed by the stream. They would meet at the same place the next day. For many weeks that followed, John would meet Grandfather every morning by the stream. Grandfather first taught him to survive with nothing, allowing the earth to provide while obeying her laws. He also taught him how to track, even over solid rock. Lessons in awareness and stalking occurred almost every day without fail. And intertwined with it all was the philosophy of living with the earth. After several weeks of training in the physical skills, Grandfather began to teach John the spiritual ways. Here, too, John was quick to learn whatever Grandfather taught, remaining open to all of Grandfather's philosophies. John was a fast and eager learner, and often begged Grandfather to teach him more than he could handle. Grandfather, too, got much from teaching John. For the first time in his life, he felt a hope for the people of the earth, and John was the embodiment of that hope. John's love and excitement for the skills must have filtered back to the reservation, for after a while, John began to bring back other young people who wanted to learn. Though the young men and women he brought back with him were not as eager to learn as John was, they were still at least interested. These people, too, gave Grandfather even more of a sense of hope for the future. However, it perplexed Grandfather that he had not been invited to the reservation. John and the others who had come to him always seemed to be sneaking away to see him. They were sensitive of their movements and always seemed to be hypervigilant for any signs of a patrol. It was obvious that they did not want to be seen by either the patrols or by certain people of the reservation. Bothered by the fact that he could not go to the reservation, Grandfather finally confronted John over the reason he had to remain secret. John told Grandfather that not everyone in the tribe could be trusted. There were some who were corrupt and close to the white man. If they found out that some of the young people were going back to the old ways, there would surely be repercussions in one form or another. Grandfather thought it very sad that some of the tribe could not be trusted. He wondered how many other traditions of brotherhood had been beaten out of the people. He could see that many of the people were deliberately turned against each other, creating a mistrust. This mistrust would keep people from openly saying anything about the conditions they lived under, a definite sign of psychological warfare. Upon Grandfather's urging, John finally took him into the heart of the reservation, but at first only under the cover of night. In all the times he had ever visited the reservation, he had remained only on the outskirts, never to their centers of population. Nothing in the past could prepare Grandfather for what he was about to see in the visits that followed. He found the conditions deplorable. Many dwellings were nothing but poorly made boxes without floors and no internal heat. There were no real sanitation facilities. Running water was rare, and only a few of the houses had electricity. Garbage lay everywhere. Truly, the white man had reduced these once proud people to animals. Soon, Grandfather was introduced to numerous trusted people by John. Here Grandfather could see how the horror had spread even to the souls of the people. He was horrified to see these once proud people who lived so close to the earth now battered, imprisoned, and broken. He saw people who lived in constant fear of each other and the white man. Most of all, the people seemed to have lost all hope. It was at this point that Grandfather began to sense a tremendous loss. The people of the earth were being wiped out right before his eyes, and he stood by helpless. Though his people still remained free, these people were his people too. Depression and pain washed over him as he saw and finally understood the oppression of the white man. Grandfather stayed at the edge of the reservation for several more weeks. Most of his students had lost interest in what he was teaching or moved on to something else. John remained extremely interested, but finally moved on to teach at another reservation. In John, Grandfather saw his hope stay alive. John was going to work in the reservation school and hopefully teach the children some of the old skills and the ways of the Spirit. As Grandfather began to wander back to the southwest, he could clearly see that the battle that lay ahead for John was immense indeed. It would seem almost impossible that any one lone man could effect any kind of change. Grandfather's heart was also heavy with sadness and depression. He felt that he was one of the only ones left who was free to practice the old ways. He was alone. During his trek back to his people, Grandfather became wrapped in the deepest depression of his life. His sense of being alone, of loss, became overwhelming at times. He knew that there were elders on all reservations that still lived in the old ways, but his main worry was for the future generations. White man's brainwashing and his plan to acculturate the Native Americans were affecting the thinking of the children and the young adults. The old ways were looked upon as primitive, and the children were ridiculed for showing any interest in them. Sometimes children would be openly punished for seeking the old ways. The lure and the empty promises of the white race were further removing the children from the path. There was little hope in Grandfather's life at this point, and he became very bitter. Grandfather began to see himself as imprisoned, though not as it was on the reservation. He could not really be a free man to go and come as he pleased. He could not wander as did his ancestors. He was restricted, for he always had to take great care in his travels so as not to be seen. He could not travel in the open, but had to most times confine his movements to the thickets or to the cover of night. He had to remain always vigilant and aware of possible danger. This thought and realization began to imprison his soul, and he felt the pain that many people on the reservations felt. He felt his faith shaken and his spirit breaking. He began to imagine again that many of the old ways would probably die with him, for all hope seemed lost. Feeling now the huge impact that the loss of the people of the earth would be, he began to feel a certain self-loathing begin to erupt within him. He began to wonder to himself if his ways were wrong and the white man was right. He wondered if his primitive ways were indeed only for backward people. How could all those white men be wrong? After all people that lived close to the earth were now imprisoned. If the native people were right, would it not be that the white man would be the ones who lived on reservations? If the native people were close to the Creator, then they would have been able to drive the white man back to the sea from which he came. Self-doubt began to affect Grandfather's every thought, and the depression became oppressive and overwhelming. Grandfather just wanted to go back to his people to die. He could see no sense in trying to teach, for it now seemed a lost cause with no hope. Grandfather camped for many days just outside the perimeter of his people's encampment. He could not face them with the way he was feeling. Though his people still lived wild and free and practiced the old ways, this was but an illusion. His people were as restricted and imprisoned as he. They were old now, with no young blood to pass on the skills to. They were a dying clan, a clan of the old ways, with no one to teach. He did not want to go to them bearing the spirit of bad news or tell them that they were among the last. In their latter years, he felt that it would be best if they continued to live believing that there were other wild and free tribes roaming the wilderness. He had to wait before he faced them so that he could compose his thinking. One morning, as he sat in his sacred area and prayed, Coyote Thunder came to him. Grandfather was startled to see him standing there. Without waiting for Grandfather to speak, Coyote Thunder said, "We knew many days ago that you were coming. We also know what troubles your heart, for I too have seen the pain of broken spirits. That is why I will not allow the people of the clan to get too close to the white man. Instead, we prefer to remain hidden until our final days. You now see no hope, but there is hope. You must teach anyone who will listen. The things of truth and spirit will never pass away, but prevail in the end. They will always be part of those who seek the earth and walk close to the spirit. Teach all who seek the earth, no matter race or belief. For those who seek the earth will become the new children of the earth. Our ways will not die. In the final days, man will seek these things again that we know." Coyote Thunder walked away in silence, giving Grandfather no chance to speak. He could feel a renewed sense of hope arising within him. He knew that it was his vision, his destiny, to teach, and he now knew that he should try to teach anyone who would listen, whether Native American or white. He knew that Coyote Thunder was right. The old ways and philosophies would not die. Someday, the white man will eventually see the emptiness of his ways and the numbness of his flesh, Then the old ways will be reborn. He had to pass them down so that when the white man began to search beyond his own flesh, he could find a way. Without hesitation now, and with a renewed sense of hope, Grandfather went back to his people and awaited his next journey, his next student. I could now understand what Grandfather had given to Half-Tree. He had given him hope, possibly for the first time in his life. I am sure that Half-Tree had felt the same way as did all people imprisoned on a reservation, knowing that he was one of the last of the people. Humiliated, ridiculed, and broken, Half-Tree could do nothing but hate himself. After all, that is what the white man had led him to believe. I could also begin to identify with Grandfather and Half-Tree. After all, I was seeking the old ways of skill and spirit. I was imprisoned by a white society that would not allow me to practice what I lived and believed. I felt ridiculed, scorned, and treated like an outsider by many of my friends. I was more like Grandfather than I could ever imagine, and from that day, Half-Tree and I became brothers.